Welcome back to Little House on Laurel. This year we had a wonderful crop of small pumpkins from our garden. The pumpkins are lining the floor of our pantry waiting for me to use them in recipes this fall and winter. I have 4 sourdough pumpkin recipes for you today, and these are for breakfast. So the first one that I'm going to share with you is a new recipe that I made for pumpkin sourdough waffles, and you can find this printable recipe on the blog. I'll leave a link for you. First, I added a cup of sourdough starter, and then I added 1 cup of pumpkin puree and 1.5 cups of milk. And then I'm adding 1 tablespoon of honey, and 2 eggs. Then 1 cup of melted coconut oil, or you can do melted butter, and 1 teaspoon of vanilla. And you're going to mix up all the wet ingredients. And then I'm adding the dry ingredients to the wet ingredients. You could add them to a mixing bowl first and then mix them and then add them into the wet ingredients. It's up to you. But you want to add 1 3/4 cups of flour, 1 teaspoon of salt, 2 teaspoons of baking soda, 1 teaspoon of pumpkin pie spice. I seem to never have pumpkin pie spice around when I need it. So if you're the same way, instead of the 1 teaspoon of pumpkin pie spice, you can do 1/4 teaspoon ginger, 1/8 teaspoon nutmeg, 1/8 teaspoon of cloves, and 1/2 teaspoon of cinnamon. And then you'll mix all of the dry ingredients with the wet ingredients until it's well blended. And then you can cover it with plastic wrap and let the batter ferment in the refrigerator overnight or for up to 3 days. Or if you don't have time to let it ferment, you can just go ahead and start cooking your waffles. I have full instructions on my blog that I will link to if you're wondering how to use a cast iron waffle maker. Otherwise, you can just use your electric waffle maker. I use a little more than 1/2 cup of batter when I'm making them in the cast iron waffle maker. You would use about 1 cup of batter for an electric Belgian waffle maker. And then these are delicious, served with butter, warm maple syrup, whipped cream, and cinnamon on top. I hope you'll enjoy these for a wonderful fall breakfast. Now the second recipe I'm making is also new, and you'll find the link for that too in the description box. I'm making pumpkin sourdough scones with maple glaze. So first you're going to add 2.5 cups of all-purpose flour, 1/2 cup of brown sugar, 1 tablespoon of baking powder, and then 1 tablespoon of pumpkin pie spice. And again, if you don't have pumpkin pie spice, you can use 1.5 teaspoons of cinnamon, 1 teaspoon of ginger, 1/4 teaspoon of nutmeg, and 1/4 teaspoon of cloves. And you want to give all of that a whisk. And then you're going to add 1/2 cup of cold butter cut into pieces. And you can use either a pastry blender or 2 knives or even a food processor to cut the butter into the dry ingredients. You want to do this until the largest pieces of butter are the size of peas. And this is a process that takes a while unless you have the food processor. But I'm talking to my kids anyway, so you can just do something while you're working on it. Okay, so now I'm adding 1/2 cup of heavy cream to a separate bowl, and then 1/2 cup of sourdough discard, 1 large egg. And you want to beat it before you place it in there. And a 1/2 cup of pumpkin puree. And whisk all of that together. Now I'm adding the wet ingredients into the dry ingredients, and I'm using my Danish dough hook to mix everything up. You could use your hands. You just want to stir it until everything starts to come together, and then I sprinkle my counter, and I'm going to fold the scone dough over several times to help it to form together. It's kind of like kneading the dough. You just want to make sure that you don't over knead the dough because it'll become too tough if you do that. I am adding more flour because the dough is a little sticky. Now what I'm going to do is form the dough into a square with my hands, and I want it to be about 1 1/4 inches thick. And then I'm using a bench scraper to cut the square into 4 smaller squares. And then I'm going to cut each of those smaller squares in half. So you'll end up with 8 triangles. And then placing the triangles onto the parchment paper and brushing the tops with some more heavy cream. And then I'm putting it into a 400-degree preheated oven and baking it for 18 to 20 minutes or until golden brown. In the meantime, I'm making the maple glaze by whisking together 3 tablespoons of melted butter, 1/3 cup of pure maple syrup, 1/2 teaspoon of vanilla, and 1/8 teaspoon of cinnamon, and then 1 to 1 1/2 cups of powdered sugar. And you just kind of need to gauge that by how thick it is. If you need it to be a little thicker, you're going to add up to 1 1/2 cups of powdered sugar. And then you just want to drizzle the maple glaze over the cooked pumpkin scones while they're still warm. And if you want, you can add some coarse sugar on top too. It just gives it a fun little festive feel, a little bit of texture. This next recipe is my pumpkin sourdough cinnamon rolls, and I already have a video of how to make these, so you could look at that for more detail. But right now I'm combining my fed sourdough starter, 1/2 cup of sourdough starter, 1/2 cup of water, 1/2 cup of pumpkin puree, 1/4 cup of melted butter, and 2 tablespoons of honey. And I'm also adding the 3 cups of all-purpose flour and 3/4 teaspoons of sea salt. Now you're going to mix this together until the dough forms into a ball, and then grease the bowl and cover it with plastic wrap and a towel and let it rise overnight to ferment. And then the next day I am flouring the surface, putting my dough on there so I can roll it out. And I'm just going to roll it out like I would with any kind of cinnamon roll into a large rectangle about 1/4 to 1/2 inch thick. Now when I made the filling for these, I melted the butter in a saucepan and then added the pumpkin puree. So 1/4 cup butter, 1/4 cup pumpkin puree, 1/2 cup of sucanat or brown sugar, 1/2 teaspoon each of ginger, nutmeg, cloves, and allspice, and then 1 tablespoon of cinnamon. But you'll see when I'm rolling these cinnamon rolls up that the filling is squeezing out. It's too runny. And so what I would suggest is just softening the butter and then using a stand mixer with a beater to mix in all the rest of the filling ingredients. And then you'll just slather that on top of the rolled out dough. And that will work much better when you're rolling it up. All right, so I'm adding the filling, and you want to leave a 1/2 inch border around the edges. And then roll it up lengthwise. And you want to roll it as tight as you can. And then when you get to the end, you pull the edges over and pinch the end to the other side of the roll so it'll stay in place and not come undone. And then you can use dental floss to cut the roll into 12 smaller rolls. And this is just me kind of measuring. I like to measure it all out and make an indent ahead of time. It makes it easier to cut it into equal pieces. And then I cooked this in a cast iron pan. And now if you are not going to eat them right away, if you're going to have any leftovers sitting in the pan, it's better to cook them in like a casserole dish or on a baking sheet. I know this because we left them in the pan for a couple of days and it started rusting my pan. While they're baking at 375 degrees for 20 to 25 minutes, or until golden brown, I'm making the frosting. I'm adding 8 ounces of cream cheese softened, 2 tablespoons of softened butter, 1/4 cup of pure maple syrup, 1 teaspoon of milk, and 1 teaspoon of vanilla. And you want to beat that until smooth and pour it over the warm pumpkin sourdough cinnamon rolls. These are delicious served warm with milk. Will make a wonderful fall breakfast your family will enjoy. And my last recipe for you for pumpkin sourdough breakfast is pumpkin sourdough muffins with chocolate chips. And this one I actually like to use einkorn flour, freshly milled. You could replace this with all-purpose flour. You might just need a little bit more all-purpose flour than einkorn flour. Grinding the flour, and I'm going to take 1 3/4 cups of the einkorn flour and add that to a bowl. I'm going to add 1/8 teaspoon each of ginger, nutmeg, cloves, and allspice, and a 1/2 tablespoon of cinnamon, and then 1 teaspoon of baking soda, 1/2 teaspoon of baking powder, and 3/4 teaspoons of salt. And you'll give that a stir. And then I'm adding into the mixer 1/3 cup of honey, 1/3 cup of softened butter, 1/2 cup of sourdough starter, it can be discard or fed, 2 whole eggs at room temperature, and 15-ounce can of pumpkin puree, or you can just do 2 cups of homemade pumpkin puree like I am. And you'll mix that all together till it's well blended. And then we're going to add the dry ingredients to the wet ingredients now. You'll mix it well again till it's smooth. You're going to add in 1/2 cup of chocolate chips. And I'm pouring the batter into my muffin cups, where you can grease muffin cups. And you want to do it about 2/3 full. And this makes about 15 muffins. And you'll bake these in a 350-degree oven for about 17 minutes or until the toothpick comes out clean. I made these for our son's homeschool group. They really enjoyed these, and it's fun to tell everyone that these are really healthy. I hope you enjoyed these pumpkin sourdough breakfast recipes. I will have all of the links to these recipes in the description box. I would love to hear which one is your favorite recipe. I'll see you soon.